William George Herons, Lonnie David Franklin Jr., Albert Fish, Harvey Murray Glatman, Clifford Robert Olson Jr., James D'Angelo, Sheila LaBar, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. Ordinary names, but for serial killers, ordinary names are never good enough. We have to give them names that capture their dark souls, names that capture the evil they have become, capture the rare unthinkable. The Lipstick Killer, the Grim Sleeper, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Lonely Hearts Killer, the Beast of British Columbia, the Golden State Killer, the Avenging Angel, the Milwaukee Cannibal.
When we hear about somebody who moves from community to community, calculating who to kill next, which prostitute to get, these crimes shock the conscience because they are so out of the ordinary. They are so different from what, sadly, we've become quite used to. The more ordinary rape, the more ordinary assault, the more ordinary robbery, the more ordinary kidnapping. There are these crimes that just shock the conscience. And so I fully understand why the public is preoccupied with them. I think they are so outside the box that we have this understandable need to try to grasp. Why would somebody do that? That's human nature. Why would somebody take a rifle, sit behind a barricade, and wait for innocent victims? Why would somebody do that? Why would somebody look for vulnerable children, kidnap them, torture them sexually, and kill them? It's hard for us to wrap our minds around these kinds of crimes. And it makes complete sense to me that the average human being would be both fascinated by this, horrified by this, mystified by this, and preoccupied by this. Why?
True crime. Americans, particularly women, love true crime. A nonfiction literature, TV, and film genre in which actual crimes of real people are explored in depth. A genre which exploded at the beginning of the 21st century. A genre that focuses on murder. The more hideous and bizarre, the better. Cases in point. The Jean Bonnet murder, the O.J. Simpson trial, and Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. All showed there was a vast appetite all across America for such stories. But the biggest subcategory of true crime is the story of the serial killer. These stories are the most gruesome and shocking. At the heart of these stories lay perplexing questions. Who are these serial killers? Why do they kill? How can they keep killing? And are they a danger to me and my family? Prior to the true crime explosion, psychologists and criminal investigators thought they had the serial killer figured out. But it turns out the answers are much more complex and troubling. Even the profile of the typical serial killer has changed dramatically. It is a change in the profile of who serial killers are and why they kill. It is a change that will send chills up your spine. In the past, largely because of media portrayals, The serial killer was a white male somewhere between 20 and 40 years of age, psychopathic, and probably quite smart. No serial killer helped to shape that media image better than Ted Bundy.
If you ever watched that interview with Ted Bundy, his last day before he was executed, the entire time Bundy is shifting his eyes. He's watching very carefully around him, because that's what psychopaths do. Psychopaths are about control. They want to control their environment. Healthy men, we don't try to do that. We don't try to control our environment. We just try to survive ourselves. We're not trying to control people around us. True psychopaths, that's what they do. They control everybody around them, the narrative.
Theodore Robert Bundy, also known as Ted Bundy, or the Genius of Death, is perhaps the best-known serial killer who ever lived. A serial killer who broke the mold in many ways. A man who is estimated to have killed anywhere from 30 to 100 women. A brutal serial killer who told everyone that he was a rapist who had to kill in order to stay free. Mysteriously, Ted Bundy appeared to be anything but a serial killer. He was a Boy Scout, a prominent member of the Republican Party in the state of Washington. He even volunteered at Seattle, Washington's suicide hotline.
Ted Bundy, who killed dozens of women across the country, also worked on a suicide hotline in Seattle. He also saved the life of a 4-year-old drowning boy. And whether he was taking lives or saving lives, he was feeling powerful. And that's a very important motive among serial killers.
Adding to his mystique, Bundy was a brilliant student, admired by his college professors.
I think one of the most interesting things about Ted Bundy is the image that people have of him. He is seen as some kind of misguided genius. You know, really not such a bad guy. I mean, after all, he only killed dozens of women across the country, you know, in Washington and Utah and Colorado and Michigan and Florida. And by the way, he was also a rapist. His last victim was a 12-year-old girl in Florida, Kimberly Leach. He murdered her by shoving her face in the mud until she suffocated. You know, I don't see him as a misguided anything. I see him as a monster.
As a serial killer, Bundy had a number of factors working in his favor. He was an ordinary, good-looking guy. A guy who used all the glad-handing skills he'd learned during his days of associating with politicians.
I think there's a myth that is propagated because Ted Bundy was a charming, handsome guy. It was easy for him to lure his victims. He didn't look like the monster that he was. He was extraordinarily ordinary in his appearance. He looked like the last person you'd suspect, not the first. And that, I think, colored the image that we have of serial killers ever since the 1970s.
It is the myth of the evil serial killer genius. The serial killer genius brilliantly portrayed by Anthony Hopkins in the 1991 movie The Silence of the Lambs. But with Ted Bundy, what appeared to be genius may have been dumb luck more than anything else.
One of the things about Ted Bundy that I think sets him apart, besides the sheer number of women that he killed, was his chutzpah. This was a guy who was very brash in many of the things that he did, and committed crimes that were that took a great deal of risk to perform. In one case, he went to a very popular recreation area, Lake Sammamish, and wore a fake cast on his arm and elicited the help of 2 different young women to help get a boat onto or off of his automobile, and then actually got them to accompany him to another location where twice in the same day he raped and murdered these 2 women in the same location. They were both kidnapped from a very public place. Numerous people saw him that day, were able to provide descriptions of him that day, were able to provide a description of his automobile, and yet he wasn't apprehended after that.
Bundy was born in Burlington, Vermont, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers. The identity of his father was never known, though relatives were suspicious about his grandfather, who was abusive and violent to his mother, Louise. Raised by his grandparents, he believed his mother was really his sister. Indeed, the truth about Bundy's young mom was hidden for the next 20 years. In 1950, Louise and Ted moved to Tacoma, Washington, where she married Johnny Culpepper Bundy. Throughout his childhood and into college, Bundy remained shy and never fit in socially. While attending the University of Washington, he met a vivacious young co-ed, Stephanie Brooks, who later dumped him because of his immaturity and lack of ambition. But Bundy wasn't through with her. In fact, in a macabre fashion, he would never be through with her. In 1968, Bundy changed. He became more ambitious, a man who wanted to be in charge. He rekindled his relationship with Stephanie. Then, just after New Year's 1974, he abruptly broke it off. A few days later, he began his violent attacks against women. Once Bundy began killing, he became an insatiable murderer. His signature was his brutality. All his victims, except the last, were killed by a savage blow to the head. At the same time, all his victims looked like his ex-girlfriend.
Ted Bundy, he chose his victims, I think, because of appearance of his girlfriend. If you look at photographs of his victims, all of them have the long dark hair, and usually it's parted down the middle, and there's a very similar appearance to each one of them, which is a very similar appearance to his girlfriend.
Bundy's first known murder victim was a 21-year-old college student, Linda Ann Healy. Bundy snuck into her apartment, knocked her unconscious, wrapped her in a sheet, and carried her out of the apartment. Her skull was found a year later. Now, Bundy's frenzy for rape and murder dominated him completely. For the next year and a half, Bundy murdered at least 27 women as he traveled through Oregon, Colorado, and Utah on a brutal killing spree. Police in each state reported female victims, all young and attractive. He was finally captured in Granger, Utah, after a botched kidnapping. Bundy was sentenced to 15 years. But escaping from jail, he made it to Florida, where he killed at least 3 more times before he was caught and sentenced to death in Florida's electric chair, Old Sparky. On January 24th, 1989, the so-called genius of death was himself finally dead. So, what is the truth about who are serial killers? Criminal psychologist Dr. Eric Hickey updates the serial killer profile.
There are thousands of movies done about white serial killers, but there's only one that was ever done by a black serial killer. And according to FBI definition, over 50% of all serial killers are African American.
For example, Lonnie Franklin was a black serial killer who lived in Los Angeles. He was known as the Grim Sleeper. The nickname was due to a 14-year hiatus in the murders from 1988 to 2002. The murders occurred in Los Angeles.
He was going after black women, okay, and they're prostitutes. Low-hanging fruit. It's easy to get to. People aren't going to miss them. He wasn't going after middle-class black women or well-to-do women. He was going after black prostitutes who really were kind of faceless. And that really kind of made him invisible. The only reason he came back to light was because it had been 14 years, they made a connection. Did he kill other people? Possibly. They have not made that connection yet. Someday they actually may make that connection because he was kind of hiding in plain sight. He was right there. Police went by him all the time.
Neighbors described Franklin as friendly and quiet. He would sometimes stop to chat with people in the neighborhood and was frequently seen working on cars in his front yard. Lonnie openly spoke with contempt about prostitutes and said they deserved to die. He showed friends photographs he had taken of women in sexually explicit poses. A friend of Franklin said, "He would have violent fantasies. He was putting the girls down saying, 'Someone is going to kill these girls,' saying they were going to wind up dead." Interestingly, Franklin used the same small caliber revolver to murder his victims after assaulting and strangling them, and then kept photos of his victims as trophies in his home. His known victims included Deborah Jackson, Henrietta Wright, Barbara Ware, Bonita Sparks, Mary Lowe, Alice Monique Alexander, Lucretia Jefferson, Anitra Washington, Valerie McCorvey, Janice Peters, and Princess Bartholomew. Franklin was apprehended when DNA evidence linked him to the murders. He was arrested on July 7, 2010, at his home in the Manchester Square neighborhood. He was finally convicted for the deaths of 9 women and a teenage girl and was sentenced to death on August 10, 2016. Another less-known black serial killer was the Milwaukee North Side Strangler, a name given to Walter E. Ellis, who raped and strangled 7 female prostitutes in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, between 1986 and 2007.
Usually he was kind of in that seamy underbelly of the city, and he'd grab women off the streets and he'd take them to abandoned, filthy buildings and kill them and then leave their bodies. They finally caught him after, I think, 12 years of it, and what they did was they got DNA from him on a victim, and they charged the DNA, the donor of the DNA, to keep the case open. So when they arrested the guy, the sexual assaults wouldn't have run out because of time limits. So they charged that DNA. It was a great move, great move.
On February 24, 2011, Ellis was given 7 life sentences. 2 years later, he died in prison. Notice that the killing pattern here fits the mold of many white male serial killers. Men hiding in plain sight, while at night, brutally killing female victims lost to the world through prostitution, drugs, and homelessness. FBI agents now know that Hispanics also fit the profile of a serial killer. The most notorious was Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker. Born in Texas in 1960, Richard Ramirez was an Hispanic American serial killer who murdered at least 14 people and raped and tortured at least 24 more, mostly during the spring and summer of 1985. After developing epilepsy as a child, He became a heavy drug user and cultivated an interest in Satanism, which became a calling card for investigators at his crime scenes. His fall into complete evil and a life of killing began in California at age 24. He lived in LA, where petty theft and burglaries bankrolled his drug habit. Then, stealing turned to murder.
One of the things that sets him apart a little bit is the fact that he was a home invader. You know, that's a little bit different. But again, you have a guy who I think got caught up in the mythology of it and the attention of it. He loved it. He played into it. He specifically tailored his acts to attain additional attention.
Jenny Vincow, age 79, was an elderly woman, a grandmother. In June 1984, Ramirez broke into her room, and when he couldn't find anything of value, rage took over. He stabbed her, and then, like Jack the Ripper, he slit her throat and mutilated her corpse. This began his terror up and down the coast of California.
When Ramirez would attack middle-class families in the middle of the night, he was seen as a tremendous threat to the residents of Los Angeles. He was seen as what he was, a guy who could attack anyone, which means that you could be next. And that terrified the people who lived there.
He was the worst of them all. He entered where people thought they were the safest, their homes. He shot some, he stabbed some, and he kicked some to death. He mutilated the bodies of many. In the end, 14 were dead, and who knows how many others he raped and sodomized. But one of these victims escaped. Apprehended in August 1985, Ramirez was sentenced to death at the conclusion of his trial in 1989. He spent the remainder of his days at California's San Quentin prison before dying from cancer on June 7, 2013, at age 53. But not all serial killers take women as victims. Some prefer boys and young men. Such was the case of John Wayne Gacy, the clown killer, a disreputable homosexual serial killer. This overtly macho man with the name John Wayne would kill at least 33 young men and boys between the age of 15 and 21. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois on March 17, 1942. And, like most serial killers, he had a troubled youth.
John Gacy apparently had a very overbearing father, a dominating father. They make a lot of the fact that he would disappear into his basement, after, drunkenly raging upon the family. He would then disappear into a basement to which the children were not allowed. But essentially, Gacy was a man who lived in his day-to-day life as sexually straight. He had a wife, he had children. He was a known person in his community. He dressed as a clown and did children's parties and things of this nature. Yet he obviously had within him not only the violent desire to control and murder people, but he controlled and murdered boys. His homosexual nature of his crimes was in stark contrast to his day-to-day life, where he lived as a straight man and an upright model of the community. But he apparently used the lure of kind of a party, like, hey, in my basement you can watch porno movies, you can smoke pot, you can get drunk even though you're not old enough. And he apparently had something that he called the handcuff trick, where he would show that he had this trick pair of handcuffs and he'd put them on and then show how they came off. And then he would either switch the handcuffs to a different pair or use the same pair but not share the trick of how to get off them, put them on, and once he had control of the victim, he gave in to the darkest of inner demons and tortured his victims apparently at length and over an extended period of time before killing them, and then ultimately depositing them in his basement with lime as well to hasten the decomposition of their bodies.
Typical of a blossoming serial killer, Gacy's perverted behavior surfaced in his mid-20s. He was prosecuted for sodomizing 2 teenage boys in Waterloo, Iowa in 1968. He probably committed more criminal acts for which he wasn't caught. After 2 years in prison, he was paroled and moved back to Chicago, where, hidden from his friends, family, and social community, he continued his perverted actions, sodomizing young boys. Then, in 1975, he crossed over the line and began killing. Chose to kill, knowing full well that it was wrong. His targets were young men and boys, who have been defined by criminologists as the less dead, men and women who live on the fringes of society, people who, if killed, would not be missed. In Gacy's case, young male prostitutes and homeless runaways.
There was actually a reporter in Chicago who had connections within the gay community, and there was talk amongst the gay community, the prostitute community at least, that awful lot of boys were going missing without being known. And in fact, there was a case of one boy who had been taken to Gacy's house. He had played the handcuff trick on him. He choked him. He had repeatedly forced his head underwater in a bathtub and then let him breathe and then put him back underwater almost to death. And then for reasons known only to Gacy, he let him go. And this young fellow remembered the type of car that the rapist had and sort of what the exit looked like that he got off the highway. And his family waited there at that exit, waiting for someone to come who had a car that looked like what he said the car looked like. They found it. They followed him to his house. They reported it to the police. The police came. They investigated, but did not believe the boy's story. And Gacy was able to continue his activities for several years.
But like many serial killers, John Wayne Gacy became cocky and overconfident.
He had abducted a boy who had just left a drugstore where he'd picked up some photographs that had been developed. When the boy disappeared, Gacy's name came up. Gacy had some record. He did have a record of having, of some sexual crimes, and so that was a red flag for the cops. They came to his house, they searched his house, and they found the ticket for those photographs. And so they knew that the boy had been in his house.
He was pretty bold in the way he committed his killings. He seemed to think that if he put lye down there, no one was going to smell the dead bodies deteriorating. And basically that was his fallibility, because a police officer who had been actually having dinner with Gacy had been playing a game because he'd been under surveillance for a long time after a lieutenant in the Des Plaines Police Department had taken more time with this missing persons case because his boy was the same age as the boy who was missing. And they had had him under surveillance for a long time, and Gacy just invited him up for supper. So they went. And he couldn't get this feeling of smelling something, and he didn't know what it was. And for days he couldn't figure it out. And it finally dawned on him it was autopsy smell. So that's when they got a warrant, based on police officer's nose, and Gacy was done right then and there.
The Gacy case was so incredible, killing and burying 30 young victims right in his own home. So terrible and so sensational that serial killers began gaining celebrity status, almost lionized as anti-heroes. But John Wayne Gacy was anything but an anti-hero. He was no more than a pathetic man who chose to kill again and again. Just as ethnic minorities and homosexual men joined the recognized ranks of serial killers, so did women. Perhaps their number of victims even exceed that of men.
We've certainly had females who are more aggressive than some male serial killers. There isn't a way to say there's a female type of serial killer, because some kill for gain. Quite often they kill for gain. They kill their husbands, for insurance, or whatever the husband has. They might kill their children because the children are a burden, or they're looking for attention, or they have a mental illness. Quite often you're going to find something like Munchausen syndrome by proxy in that group, or borderline personality disorder, something like that. But we still do have predatory females who are looking for personal gain. They don't tend to kill for reasons of lust, but some have. I've actually seen statements where there's no such thing as a female lust murderer, and that's just not true.
There was the case of Gail Graham and Catherine May Wood.
There were two who worked together in an elder care facility in Michigan, and they would together kill patients and then as part of their sex games, and then wash down the bodies and have sex in a vacant room.
The two women met at the Alpine Manor nursing home shortly after Graham had moved to Michigan from Texas. They quickly became friends and then lovers in 1986. 2 years later, they both were facing murder charges for allegedly smothering 5 elderly patients as part of a love bond. Wood claimed Graham murdered the patient to relieve her tension. Wood was described as the psychopathic manipulator, and Graham as a susceptible woman with a personality disorder. Graham is serving a life sentence, and Wood was given early release from prison. So not only are women part of the expanded profile of the serial killer, but also gay women. So serial killers are not just white males. In fact, serial killers are represented by a full spectrum of gender and racial diversity. But what about the idea that serial killers are all clever, intelligent, even brilliant? That idea came from an early sample of interviews with white male serial killers.
The early profilers in the behavioral science unit, as it was called then, it's now the behavioral analysis unit, but they went around and did some prison interviews which were not in any way representative. It was white, incarcerated, articulate serial killers who agreed to talk to them. That is not a representative population by any means. So from that, they generated notions about serial killers. And if you pick the ones who are articulate and smart, it's going to seem as if serial killers are smarter than the average person. But we know that that is not true. There's diversity in their intellect, in their range of IQ scores, just as there is everything else about them. So unfortunately, many of the early ideas that ended up in criminological textbooks and other kinds of mass media books about serial killers came from studies that really weren't representative at all of serial killers.
Interestingly, the definition of the serial killer has changed over the recent decades as well.
The concept of a serial killer has evolved from being someone who kills in at least 3 locations, at least 3 incidents with a cooling off period, to now someone who kills in at least 2 incidents without any of the psychological framework. So that makes a difference in terms of what we think about what goes on in the mind of a murderer. Generally speaking, we tend to focus on what's usually called the classic serial killer, which is generally driven by lust.
Indeed, for many psychologists and law enforcement investigators, having a sexual component to the serial killings was believed to be essential motivation behind these cruel acts.
Many serial killers have used sex as a vehicle for gaining a sense of power and control and dominance over their victims. It's not just taking their lives. It's making their victims suffer. They maximize the pain. And it's not enough to view the pain and suffering of their victims. They personally are responsible for it. And that gives them a sense of superiority. The more their poor victims scream and beg for mercy, the better they feel about themselves. And that's part of the motivation of a serial killer. Sex is the medium through which they feel great accomplishments. What you and I might see as dastardly, as hideous, as grotesque, these serial killers see as their greatest achievements in life.
The sexual component in serial killings can take many forms. Gary Ridgway, Washington State's Green River Killer, strangled his female victims and dumped their bodies in forested and overgrown areas of King County, Washington. Later, he returned to the bodies to have sexual intercourse with them. Notorious Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, appeared to be an exception.
Berkowitz, the .44 caliber killer, or whatever he's referred to, he's also referred to Son of Sam because of the dog that he supposedly heard from that told him to commit these acts, which he claimed at one time. I think killed because he enjoyed it. I think he's just one of those people that was enraged and probably had some trauma in his background that was primed to go out and start shooting people. May have been lonely. There are a number of explanations you can give because there's not a whole lot of detail known about Berkowitz prior to the killings. But as to what makes him tick, I think it's, I don't know, I think it's trauma, and the trauma that caused the rage that finally broke out into what he considered his fantasies, which was shooting people, shooting couples with a weapon, with a .44 caliber revolver.
Most serial killers are up close and personal with their victims. They use their hands. They strangle, they stab, they mutilate, and that's what makes them feel good. It's the control that they have over the pain and suffering of their poor victims. But Son of Sam was different. David Berkowitz used a firearm to kill his 6 victims, so he actually distanced himself from them. And it's that fact alone that makes you wonder what his motive was.
The Son of Sam was born Richard David Falco in Brooklyn, New York in 1953. The adopted son of Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, he was an odd and aloof child. He delighted in setting fires. Berkowitz joined the U.S. Air Force and served from 1971 to 1974. As he matured, a dark and compulsive need to kill took over his body, a need he could not suppress for very long. His reign of terror lasted from July 1976 to July 1977. He shot unsuspecting victims from point-blank range, killing 6 and wounding 7. During this time, the New York Police Department erupted with eyewitness accounts of a mysterious and elusive assailant. Terror engulfed the city. Berkowitz especially loved young, attractive women with long brunette hair, and many frightened girls dyed their hair blonde. He also enjoyed sending letters around the city, taunting police. Dear Captain Joseph Borelli, I am deeply hurt by your calling me a women hater. I am not, but I am a monster. I am the son of Sam. I am a little brat. Police, let me haunt you with these words. I'll be back. I'll be back. To be interpreted as bang, bang, bang. Ugh. Yours in murder, Mr. Monster. Berkowitz is now serving 6 life sentences. But where was the sexual component?
Berkowitz is a serial killer, you know that, and he was basically in one place, a neighborhood, where he killed lovers' ladies. Okay, well, how is that a serial killer? What's the component? What's the sexual component to that? Well, the sexual component is he would come back to the crime scene and masturbate. So there was even a sexual component to what Berkowitz did, even though his murders were not hands-on. He would fire into the car.
However, 21st century serial killer experts no longer believe there has to be a sexual component to serial murder.
When we're talking about male serial killers, especially here in the U.S., about 2/3 of them have a sexual component to their murders. And there's a sort of a myth about that if you're a serial killer, you must be a sexual predator. Well, there's some truth to that. Obviously, when we say about 2/3 do that. And it's a variety of sexual things that they do with their victims. But there's the other third that they might do it for money. They may do it for power, or simply that they want. It's a racial issue. But for that 2/3, yeah, it's a pretty interesting group.
There can be anything from glory or fame to lust to paraphilias, which is a special type of sexual deviancy, which results in weird kind of rituals. It could also be for profit. It could be philosophical. We had a couple of serial killers who were killing for existential kinds of reasons. So the mind of a murderer really depends on what's going on with a particular killer.
Within the group of serial killers that are sexual predators, some are sadistic, like John Wayne Gacy, and torture their victims before they kill them.
John Wayne Gacy was a very sexually sadistic serial killer. I mean, he didn't just kill his victims, he tortured them to death very slowly. We know that he would chew off the penises of some of his victims while they were alive. And he would also put a wire around their neck and turn like a stick. He would turn it slowly while he read to them from his Bible. So he really enjoyed, and he had a ball in their mouth so he could hear them scream, but other people couldn't hear them scream. So he enjoyed that kind of power over them, and it was very sexually arousing him to hear them screaming and crying while they're dying slowly. Killed 33 young men that way.
A case of a non-sadistic sexual predator is Larry DeWayne Hall. Born in 1962, the son of an undertaker, he was bullied as a youth. Between 1987 and 1994, he killed at least 54 women.
And Larry was a necrophile. And you'll find when you interview necrophiles that they have attachments to people. They're not interested. They're usually not sadistic. They're much more into having a relationship with the corpse. And some want them dead immediately, and so they'll snap their necks or suffocate them very quickly and have sex with them. Others will kill them and then bury them like the Green River Killer, let them cool off for a couple of days. And then they will have sex with the bodies and mutilate the corpses.
One idea about the mind of serial killers, particularly sexual predators, that there seems to be some agreement about is the idea that these vile killers have a rich fantasy life about their evil deeds.
Men, serial killers, that are involved in sex crimes have a very, very bizarre, strange, and violent fantasy life in their head. And it gets stranger and stranger and more violent as it progresses, okay? And it's all encompassing. It's there almost all the time. Wesley Dodd, who abducted young boys and killed them, said that he dreamt about his fantasies. They were there 24/7. How he could maintain a job is beyond me, okay? And there's a gentleman from Wisconsin, John Weber, who basically, his fantasies were so intense, he had to leave his workstation about 4 or 5 times a day to go to the bathroom and masturbate at work.
Westley Dodd, known as the Vancouver Child Killer, was born in Walla Walla, Washington. Dodd, one of the worst serial killers, was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder of innocent children.
I would do it again. I've been molesting kids nonstop since I was 13 years old, over half my life. Anything happened, I can guarantee I'd do it again, and sooner or later I would kill another child. I've done it before, and at the time I liked it.
Westley Dodd is what's called a misoped. He's an individual that abducts children for the sole purpose of sexual assault and murder. They're much worse than pedophiles. A pedophile might sexually assault a child, but certainly not kill that child. But misopeds kill children. He would pick them up from parks, take them home, keep them for a few days, torture them, sleep with them, and then he'd kind of whisper at night, "I'm going to kill you tomorrow morning." And the little boy would say, "Oh, no, you're not going to do that." And he would come back from work or wherever he was, and he would kill the child. He was arrested trying to abduct a young boy from a movie theater. And the boy was putting up a fight, and somebody came over and he said, "Is this your dad?" "It's not my dad," etc. And the police arrested him, and the rest is history for him. He was executed.
It turns out, serial killers say in interviews, the reality is never as good as the fantasy, which is one of the reasons they keep killing to fulfill their fantasy. One of the early debates over serial killers is the bad seed debate. Whether the serial killer, like Westley Dodd was the worst of the worst, is born evil or becomes evil as a result of circumstances.
If you're looking at the bad seed notion that somebody might be born to be evil, we do have brain research right now for psychopaths that suggests there is a difference in their brain. That does not necessarily translate to all serial killers. And we don't really yet know particularly what that difference amounts to, whether it's causal, correlational, it's not clear. So the idea of, is it nature versus nurture or the bad seed, it's always a mix of all of them, because you could have a certain type of a brain physiology that tends to be something we see in psychopaths or predators, and yet you were raised in a loving home with all kinds of advantages, and you did not become a serial killer. On the other hand, you might not have that brain physiology. You might even have all kinds of social advantages and economic advantages and still become a serial killer for other types of reasons. So you really can't say it's a bad seed. It certainly might be in the mix, but it's impossible to say how much is nature and how much is nurture for any given case.
It's also a myth that serial killers are crazy, that they don't know what they're doing.
Most serial killers are not insane in either a legal or a psychiatric sense. They generally don't hallucinate. They don't hear voices in an empty room. They don't talk to dogs. They don't suffer from a profound thought disorder. Most of them know the difference between right and wrong. They know what they're doing is wrong, but they choose to do it because it makes them feel so good, because it gives them that sense of superiority that they crave. Most of them are sociopaths or psychopaths, if you prefer. They have a disorder of character and personality that doesn't qualify for the insanity defense. but they lack a conscience. They lack what Sigmund Freud called a superego. They don't feel remorseful when they do the wrong thing.
Well, it's now officially referred to as antisocial personality disorder, which is kind of a mouthful. Sociopath and psychopath are used interchangeably. Probably the best definition came from Robert Hare, a Canadian, who talked about the fact that they don't have any empathy, and they don't, they're very easy for them to manipulate people. They see people as objects. They see people as ways to meet their own ends, whether they're going to kill them, whether they're going to climb beyond them to a higher step in industry. Not all sociopaths are serial killers. There's probably a number of sociopaths, or although the business community might call them type A personalities, who are, way up in corporations and got there because of their willingness to step over people and be very ruthless in how they got there. So it's, in the context of a serial killer, he doesn't care about the victims. He wants them to be easy. He wants them to be vulnerable because that adds to his thrill. He wants power over those people. He wants to be able to dominate them and control them for a period of time before he or she kills them.
Someone like a Ted Bundy, if you're interviewing a Ted Bundy type, he's a 35 in the PCLR. The PCLR, Dr. Robert Hare from Canada, developed this wonderful scale, 0 to 40 points. Most people are between 4 and an 8. Occasional criminals are like 10 to 16, 17. And then you get sociopaths, I call them sociopaths, between like 18 to 28 to 29. And then 30 and above are true psychopaths out of 40 points. Ted Bundy is a 35 on that scale. And the higher you go on the scale, the more psychopathy you have, the more psychopathic you are. That means the less attachment you have, the less conscience you have, less emotional. You have no empathy when you're high on that scale. But if you're a sociopath, you still have emotional attachment. You still love your mom, but you commit a lot of crime. You're still antisocial. Both of them are antisocial, sociopaths and psychopaths. But the sociopaths are just average to below average intelligence. They're not as skillful as the others. They still love their moms. They're impulsive. They don't learn from their mistakes. They have long histories of criminal behavior. When you look at psychopaths, they have less histories of criminal behavior. They don't have a conscience at all. Scott Jacobs calls them the people of the lie. They lie when they don't have to lie. They're very narcissistic. They can manipulate. They have a lot of social skills to be able to con people. They're social chameleons. And so you don't see a lot of those people in prison. You see a lot of sociopaths in prison, but not a lot of true psychopaths.
So serial killers fall on the far end of the spectrum of behavioral disorders, as well as the far end of the spectrum of murderers. Murderers that defy explanation.
Serial killers, for all the books, all the documentaries and TV shows, I think it's a little understood crime. Until the last 20 years, the FBI believed that they were all sex crimes. But that's understandable. The people in the behavioral science unit were all 50-year-old men. And according to Freud, sex is their whole prism, their whole framework. It's been true for a long time. There are multiple causes of serial murder. You can't generalize across a population of serial killers because their motives are so different. Some believe they're ridding the world of bad people. Others want that power over somebody. Many want to communicate or get attention. Some want revenge. Some have political or religious axes to grind. So, in my perception, the multiplicity of serial killer motives kind of frustrates an understanding. And you can't use one cookie cutter and understand all of them because they're just so very, very different.
Two things that haven't changed in the study of serial killers are the concepts of modus operandi and signature.
MO, modus operandi, is what is necessary for a killer to complete the job, or any criminal for that matter. Okay, you go in through a broken window, you jimmy a door lock and you get in, okay? The modus operandi can change depending on the job and what's happening in the killer's mind. The signature is something that is not necessary for the completion of the crime. It's something that the killer does in his mind to help with the fantasy. The signature never changes, ever. For example, somebody breaks into a house, they tie a woman up, they take her money, they stab her a couple of times. He might have done that a number of times, but he might put some writing on the wall or writing on the refrigerator. That's the signature. That never changes. Okay. So there's the difference.
For example, the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, always left an upside-down pentagram somewhere at the scene of the crime, sometimes on the body of the victim. It was always drawn with the victim's own lipstick, and was even drawn on the inner thighs of a victim who had been sexually assaulted before death. So why do serial killers kill? Why do some people fantasize about killing, but never go through with it? Sadly, there is no silver bullet answer. There is no one reason why serial killers kill. Each case of serial killing has its own story to tell. Perhaps that is why the evil of serial killers has held us so firmly in its grip.